As the soft hum of the city faded into the background, Lucas Thompson, an ordinary software engineer, found himself lost in a magnificent dream. The rhythmic thump of a bass drum vibrated through his chest, creating an ethereal atmosphere that blended seamlessly with the smooth jazz swirling in his mind. The music was hypnotic, a soundtrack to a scene straight out of the golden age of jazz, and in his dream, Lucas wasn't just an observer, he was part of it. In his dream, Lucas envisioned himself as the reincarnation of one of the greats, Miles Davis, back from the grave, effortlessly exuding style in a rich silk smoking jacket. He stood confidently at the center of a packed theater, commanding the stage with a trumpet in hand, as if he had been born to lead a band of legendary musicians. Around him, Ella Fitzgerald's voice floated through the air, scatting with such energy that it felt like the entire room was alive with sound. Meanwhile, Jimi Hendrix, playing an electric guitar, was shredding a solo that would have made even the gods weep, and Lucas, now Cool Breeze Thompson, was there, in the zone, playing his trumpet so passionately that the roof of the Apollo Theater seemed ready to take off into orbit. The crowd, a sea of adoring faces, seemed to chant his name, lifting him up to heights he'd never imagined. Cool breeze, cool breeze, cool breeze, they shouted, their voices mingling with the music in a beautiful symphony of adulation. Lucas felt on top of the world, his dream a perfect reflection of the kind of effortless cool he longed for in real life. But, as with all dreams, this blissful euphoria couldn't last. Just as the crescendo reached its peak, something jarring and unnatural broke the magic. A high-pitched shriek, sharp and unrelenting, cut through the harmony of the music, pulling Lucas out of his trance. It wasn't Ella hitting a particularly high note, nor was it a sound woven into the melody. No, it was something much more sinister, a piercing noise that shattered the peaceful rhythm he had come to adore. Lucas jolted awake in a panic, his mind still tangled in the echoes of his dream. His luxurious silk smoking jacket had been replaced by the much less glamorous cotton pajamas he wore to bed. The smooth jazz faded as quickly as it had arrived, and he was left in the stark silence of his apartment. But the silence didn't last long. The incessant, frantic pounding on his front door shattered his moment of confusion and frustration. Who could possibly be knocking at this hour? Lucas thought groggily. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. He stumbled out of bed, his head foggy with the remnants of his dream, and slowly shuffled toward the door. Squinting through the peephole, he nearly choked on his own breath when he saw the last person he expected, his neighbor, Susan Wilkins from 2B. Susan Wilkins was a walking, talking stereotype of a disgruntled neighbor, blonde, elderly, and loud. She was the type of person who could easily be heard from a block away, her voice carrying an unnatural sharpness that could curdle milk from 20 feet. She looked particularly agitated tonight, her face flushed with fury and her eyes wide with determination. "Open this door, boy," she shrieked through the thin wood, her voice cracking in a way that made Lucas wince. "I need you to fix my Wi-Fi." Lucas blinked several times, still unsure if he was still in the grips of his dream or if this was real life. He rubbed his eyes and let out a long sigh. The audacity of Susan Wilkins at 3 a.m. to demand tech support left him speechless. The pounding continued, the sound relentless. Lucas was done with the surreal madness of the situation. He had barely woken up, his mind still whirling from his dream, but he knew one thing for sure. Susan Wilkins wasn't going to get her Wi-Fi fixed tonight. With a groan of disbelief, he did the only thing that made sense, he turned around, walked back into his apartment, and closed the door. But, as he stood in the quiet after the chaos, he couldn't help but feel a strange, lingering sense of frustration. The serenity of his dream was now a distant memory, replaced by the absurdity of his neighbor's demand. The night had taken a turn for the worse, and sleep now felt even more elusive. With that, Lucas lay back down, knowing that rest wouldn't come easily after this bizarre interruption to his peaceful life. The next few hours passed in a foggy blur. Lucas Thompson tossed and turned in his bed, trying to shake off the strange blend of frustration and exhaustion that had settled over him. His dreams were scattered, unable to find their rhythm again. It wasn't the music of Miles Davis or the adoration of the crowd that kept him awake. It was the sheer absurdity of his neighbor, Susan Wilkins, pounding on his door at 3 a.m., demanding Wi-Fi support. Susan was a woman of many peculiarities, but demanding tech support in the dead of night was a new one. And yet, it wasn't the first time she had crossed the line. Over the past few months, Lucas had found himself on the receiving end of various odd requests, whether it was lending her sugar, helping her carry groceries, or listening to her complaints about everything from the weather to her cat's behavioral problems. But tonight, this was different. She wasn't just a neighbor asking for help, she was a woman who had taken her entitled behavior to an entirely new level. After finally managing to close the door on her, Lucas collapsed back onto his bed, frustrated and wide awake. How could anyone be so clueless, so unaware of boundaries? Susan didn't even consider that it might be inconvenient to ask for help at such an hour. And worse, the sheer audacity with which she had demanded his assistance, as though it were his sole responsibility to fix her problems, gnawed at him. It wasn't as though Lucas didn't sympathize with people who struggled with technology. He was, after all, a software engineer by profession. But there were limits. His job was to design networks, not play personal IT technician to neighbors who couldn't get their Wi-Fi to work after pressing a few buttons. And the fact that Susan had somehow convinced herself that it was his responsibility to solve her Netflix buffering issue at 3 a.m. was simply infuriating. But as much as he wanted to lie there in anger, Lucas knew there was no point in letting his frustration fester. He couldn't go back to sleep, so he decided to do the only thing that made sense at the time. He got up, got dressed, and headed to the kitchen to make himself a strong cup of coffee. If he was going to survive the day, he needed something to counteract the sleep deprivation that seemed to be creeping in. As he stood in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to brew, his mind began to race again. He found himself replaying the events from the previous night in his head, analyzing every detail. He wasn't normally one to dwell on things, but this was an exception. The situation had rattled him more than he cared to admit. How had Susan come to think that her problems were the responsibility of anyone other than herself? And more than that, how had she convinced herself that waking someone up at 3 a.m. was acceptable? The silence of the apartment was deafening as the coffee machine dripped steadily, filling the room with the rich, comforting scent. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. There had to be a way to resolve this, to put an end to Susan's ongoing demands. But for now, he needed to focus on the here and now. Get through the day, make it to work, and try to forget the bizarre interactions of the night before. As the coffee brewed, Lucas's thoughts shifted to his job. Software engineering wasn't exactly glamorous, but it paid the bills. He worked for a tech company that specialized in building custom networks for small businesses, and while the work was fulfilling, it wasn't exactly exciting. Some days it felt like all he did was stare at lines of code, solving one issue after another, without ever getting a real sense of accomplishment. But it was steady, and in today's world, that was something most people could only dream of. Lucas finally poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. The warmth of the mug in his hands was a welcome distraction from the cold, harsh reality of the situation. He knew he couldn't keep going on like this, letting Susan invade his life and break his boundaries. He needed to set some limits, not just with her, but with everyone who seemed to think that his life was somehow up for grabs. But what could he do? How could he possibly explain to Susan that he wasn't going to fix her Wi-Fi at 3 a.m. again? The thought of having to confront her made him groan. He wasn't the confrontational type, and the very idea of conflict made him uncomfortable. But this was different. He couldn't just keep letting her walk all over him. As the days slowly began to creep forward, Lucas made a promise to himself. The next time Susan came knocking at his door in the middle of the night, demanding something ridiculous, he would stand his ground. He would no longer be a passive participant in her drama. The next time, he would show her that there were boundaries, and he was no longer afraid to set them. The coffee worked its magic, slowly pushing the exhaustion to the back of his mind. Lucas finished his cup and stood up, taking a deep breath. The day was ahead of him, and though he wasn't looking forward to dealing with Susan again, he knew he was ready to take the next step. He just hoped that it wouldn't come to that. But if it did, he would be prepared. And this time, he wouldn't be the one left standing in the cold. Lucas Thompson's day unfolded with the humdrum monotony of his usual routine. He spent hours at his desk, working on coding projects that drained his mind, but the hours seemed to stretch even longer today. His thoughts kept drifting back to the bizarre and maddening events of the night before. Susan Wilkins had set a new low for annoying neighbors, and as much as he tried to focus on his work, he could feel the tension building inside him. He was dreading the inevitable next encounter with her. Around noon, Lucas found himself at the break room in his office, sipping a bottle of water and chatting briefly with his colleague, Jeff. The small talk was enough to distract him from the mounting anxiety. But just as he was about to finish his water and head back to his desk, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Susan. "Franklin, your Wi-Fi still isn't working. When are you coming over to fix it? It's not that hard, you know." Lucas blinked. "Franklin." He read the message again, but his brain struggled to process the words. She was still calling him by the wrong name, not to mention her incredibly misguided assumption that he was the one responsible for fixing her Wi-Fi. He tried to shake it off, but the sense of frustration only deepened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Something had to be done. The passive tolerance that he had shown until now wasn't working. He had to confront Susan. And he had to do it without turning into a doormat, without letting her walk all over him any longer. He couldn't keep letting this ridiculous behavior slide. That evening, after work, Lucas sat on his couch, mentally preparing himself for what was coming. The confrontation with Susan wasn't going to be pleasant, but it was necessary. He couldn't let his neighbor dictate the terms of his life any longer. He had spent far too long accommodating her whims, and it was time to set some clear boundaries. If she came knocking again, he would stand his ground. Around 7:30 p.m., the knock came. It was unmistakable. It was a loud, insistent rapping on his door, followed by an equally shrill call from the other side. "Franklin. I know you're home. Open up." It was Susan, her voice unmistakable. Lucas felt his blood pressure rise. He took a deep breath, counted to 5, and then slowly walked toward the door. His hand gripped the handle, and for a moment, he hesitated. But only for a moment. He wasn't going to back down this time. He opened the door, trying to maintain a calm expression. "Susan," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." Susan, standing in the doorway with her usual air of entitlement, glared at him. She had that same determined, demanding look in her eyes, the one she had worn the night before when she had pounded on his door. "Well, about time," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "My Wi-Fi is still down, and I need you to fix it right now." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. He wasn't about to let her dictate the conversation. "Susan, listen," he said, making eye contact with her. "I'm not your personal IT guy. It's 7:30 at night, and you've already come to my door twice demanding things from me at inconvenient hours. This has to stop." Susan's face turned a deep shade of red, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What do you mean it has to stop?" she practically hissed. "I'm your neighbor, and you owe me help when I need it." Lucas could feel his patience slipping. This was the problem. She thought her problems were the world's problems, and she had no respect for anyone else's time or space. "No, Susan," he said, his voice growing firmer. "I don't owe you help, especially when it's this late and you're being unreasonable. I'm not going to fix your Wi-Fi for you. You need to call your provider or figure it out yourself." The silence that followed was thick, filled with tension. Lucas stood his ground, not backing down even as Susan looked like she might explode. "How dare you?" Susan muttered, shaking her head. "You're nothing but a lazy, selfish man who doesn't care about his neighbors. Lucas took a deep breath, the words coming out more sharply than he intended. And you're a neighbor who doesn't know how to respect boundaries. You don't just show up at people's doors demanding things, especially at 3 a.m. That's not okay. Susan's eyes flickered with something between rage and disbelief, and for a moment, Lucas wondered if she might shout at him again. But instead, she took a step back, her arms uncrossing as her anger deflated, though the smoldering resentment still lingered. You can't just act like you don't owe anyone anything, she hissed before adding, I'll make sure the whole building knows what kind of person you are. Lucas didn't flinch. Do whatever you want, he said. But I'm done helping you out with things that aren't my responsibility. This is over. With a final glance of disdain, Susan turned and walked away, her footsteps heavy as she retreated down the hallway. Lucas closed the door behind her, letting out a long exhale. It wasn't easy to stand up to someone who had been so overbearing, but he felt a sense of relief. It was done. He had finally set a boundary, and that felt better than any apology or excuse he could have offered her. He wasn't sure if Susan would be back, but he knew one thing, this was only the beginning. The moment he let his guard down, Susan would find another way to push him around. And next time, he would be ready. The next morning, Lucas awoke with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had stood his ground against Susan Wilkins, his entitled neighbor, and had finally set some boundaries. He wasn't sure what to expect in the coming days, whether Susan would try to escalate things or simply stew in her frustration, but for now, at least, he felt a bit of relief. He had dealt with the immediate problem, and that was enough. As he made his morning coffee, Lucas replayed the conversation in his head. The confrontation hadn't been easy, but he had handled it well. He had spoken calmly, he had asserted his right to privacy, and he had refused to let Susan's ridiculous demands go unchecked. Still, there was a lingering unease. Susan wasn't the kind of person who took no for an answer, and Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time he saw her at his door. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Lucas threw himself into his work, solving problems and writing code, trying to keep his mind off the tension that still clung to him. But as the evening approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as though the calm before the storm was settling in. Around 7 p.m., just as he was finishing up some paperwork, the knock came again. It wasn't as loud as the previous night's pounding, but it was persistent. Lucas sighed, already knowing who it was. He couldn't believe she was back already. Hadn't he made it clear the night before? With an exasperated groan, he walked over to the door and peered through the peephole. This time, Susan wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a uniformed police officer. Lucas's heart sank. He hadn't expected this. What was she playing at now? He had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to be the simple confrontation he had hoped for. He opened the door cautiously, trying to mask his rising anxiety. "What's going on, Susan?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Susan looked at him with a smirk, and the officer behind her gave Lucas a hard look. "Mr. Thompson," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. "We've received a call about a disturbance, and we need to speak with you." Lucas blinked, feeling the ground beneath him shift. "A disturbance?" he repeated. "What are you talking about?" Susan's face was contorted with a mix of triumph and anger. "He assaulted me," she shrieked, pointing at Lucas with an accusing finger. "Last night, he shoved me, refused to help with my Wi-Fi, and then slammed the door in my face. He's a menace." Lucas stood frozen. "Wait a minute," he said, incredulous. "That's a complete lie. I never touched you. You came to my door, demanding I fix your Wi-Fi in the middle of the night. When I refused, I closed the door. That's it. That's all that happened." The officer, his brow furrowed, glanced back at Susan, then looked at Lucas. "We've had a report from Ms. Wilkins, and we're going to need to ask you a few questions." There's a serious accusation here. Lucas felt a mix of anger and disbelief wash over him. This couldn't be happening. How had Susan turned this into a police matter? He wasn't about to let her get away with this. This is ridiculous, Lucas said, trying to keep his cool. You can check the security footage in the hallway. It'll show everything. There's no assault, no pushing. Just me refusing to help her with something that isn't my responsibility. The officer nodded and then turned to Susan. We'll need to verify your statement, ma'am. Susan's eyes widened slightly, and her smug expression began to falter. I told you what happened. He attacked me, she stammered, her voice now wavering. Lucas, still shaken but resolute, gestured to the hallway. You can check the footage. I'm telling you, this is all a misunderstanding. The officer gave a small nod and gestured for the other officer to follow him. They both moved toward the hallway, and Lucas heard their footsteps fade as they approached the security camera footage in the building's monitoring room. For a moment, there was silence. Susan stood there, glaring at Lucas with an expression that could have curdled milk. Lucas crossed his arms, refusing to back down. Minutes later, the officers returned, their expressions different. The younger officer, who had been quietly observing, now looked at Susan with a mix of pity and disbelief. Ms. Wilkins, she began, we've reviewed the footage. It's clear that Mr. Thompson didn't do anything to harm you. It shows you knocking on his door, asking for assistance, and then him politely refusing and closing the door. There's no physical altercation. Susan's face flushed with embarrassment, her earlier confidence crumbling. But she stuttered, now at a loss for words. The older officer cleared his throat and turned to Susan. Ms. Wilkins, I'm afraid you've made a false report. We're going to need to take you in for filing a false police report, which is a serious offense. Lucas could hardly believe what he was hearing. This was it. Susan Wilkins, once an entitled neighbor who had crossed the line, was now facing the consequences of her actions. Susan's face turned beet red, and she opened her mouth to protest, but the officer stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, please come with us. As Susan was escorted down the hall, still sputtering protests, Lucas stood in the doorway, his heart racing. He had never imagined that a simple disagreement over Wi-Fi would escalate this far. But now, as he watched Susan being led away in handcuffs, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The situation had finally reached a breaking point, and he wasn't the one on the wrong end anymore. In the days that followed, Lucas Thompson found himself caught in a whirlwind of legal procedures. What had started as an ordinary disagreement with his entitled neighbor, Susan Wilkins, had turned into an absurd, racially charged incident that was now attracting all kinds of attention. After Susan had been arrested for filing a false police report, Lucas knew that he wasn't just dealing with an inconvenient neighbor anymore, he was caught in a legal mess that might take weeks, even months, to resolve. Susan was taken away by the police, her face a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief, and for the first time in a long while, Lucas felt something close to relief. But that moment of peace didn't last long. The following morning, his phone rang with the unmistakable voice of his lawyer, Deborah Washington, a no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for getting things done. Lucas, we need to talk, Deborah said, her tone serious. The police may have dropped the ball on this one, but Susan is about to get some serious consequences for her actions. We're going after her for everything she's got, defamation, filing a false report, and the emotional distress she's caused you. Lucas rubbed his temples, still reeling from the events. I don't know what to think anymore, Deborah. This is all so ridiculous. I just want it to end. I get it, Deborah said, her voice softening for a moment. But we can't let her get away with this. You've already been through enough. This isn't just about Wi-Fi, it's about standing up for yourself and holding her accountable. She can't just walk around making false accusations, and we need to make sure the legal system knows that. Lucas wasn't sure if he felt more relieved or stressed after their conversation, but he knew one thing: Deborah had a point. Susan had crossed a line, and now it was time for the legal system to step in. He agreed to meet with her later in the week to go over the next steps. Meanwhile, his apartment felt oddly quiet after the drama of the past few days. He still couldn't quite wrap his mind around the fact that Susan had escalated a simple tech issue to something so far-reaching. By the time they met at Deborah's office, Lucas had already started receiving media inquiries. The story of Susan's false police report, combined with the bizarrely racial undertones of the situation, had quickly gone viral. News outlets were running with headlines like "Neighbor accuses man of assault over Wi-Fi" and "Entitled Grandma calls cops over Netflix issues." It wasn't long before Lucas was becoming a reluctant local celebrity. He didn't want the attention, but he couldn't avoid it. Sitting across from Deborah, Lucas watched as she meticulously sorted through her notes, her eyes focused on the paperwork in front of her. "All right, Lucas," she said, looking up. "We've got a strong case here. We're not just going after Susan for defamation, but also for wasting police resources. You've got the security footage, which is the key piece of evidence in your favor. But the media's involvement complicates things a bit." Lucas took a deep breath. "What do you mean by complicates things?" Deborah leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Well, the media's already spun this in a way that could make it difficult to handle in court. On one hand, it's good for us, they're painting Susan as the villain. But on the other, it means there's a lot of attention on your case now. You're not just a random guy dealing with a petty neighbor, you're now a symbol of something much bigger. This will play out in the court of public opinion just as much as in the legal system." Lucas rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to have a peaceful life, you know. Now it feels like my entire life is under a microscope." Deborah gave him a sympathetic look. "I get that, Lucas. But the media attention could actually work in your favor. People are rallying behind you, they see you as the victim here. And once we win this case, that'll be your final victory. Susan won't be able to pull this kind of stunt again. Plus, she'll have to pay for what she's done, both legally and financially." Lucas nodded slowly. He didn't care about the media attention. He didn't care about fame or recognition. But Deborah's words gave him some comfort. There was something cathartic about the idea of standing up for himself, of not letting someone like Susan get away with such outrageous behavior. This wasn't just about protecting his reputation, it was about setting a precedent, about making sure that other people like Susan couldn't just walk all over others. As the weeks passed, Deborah worked tirelessly, guiding Lucas through the legal process. She filed the necessary motions, gathered the evidence, and prepared for the court hearing. Meanwhile, Susan, once the center of all the chaos, had retreated from the public eye. Rumors about her being a racist, entitled neighbor spread through the building, and even those who had once turned a blind eye to her antics now whispered behind her back. One thing became clear during this time: Susan was losing the power she once had. Her reputation, both in the neighborhood and beyond, was in tatters. But for Lucas, it wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. He wasn't out to destroy her, he just wanted to make sure she understood the consequences of her actions. The day of the hearing arrived, and Lucas walked into the courtroom with a sense of purpose. He was no longer the quiet man trying to avoid confrontation. He was ready to fight for himself, and for anyone else who had ever been wronged by someone like Susan Wilkins. The courtroom was cold, its walls lined with rows of hard wooden benches that only seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Lucas Thompson sat in the front, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he waited for the proceedings to begin. He had never imagined that something as mundane as a neighborly disagreement over Wi-Fi would land him in a situation like this, but here he was, a reluctant participant in a legal drama that had captured the attention of the media and his entire community. Deborah Washington sat beside him, her posture straight and confident, ready for whatever the day would bring. She had been Lucas's legal guardian angel throughout the entire ordeal, providing him with both advice and unwavering support. If anyone could get Susan Wilkins to pay for her actions, it was Deborah. Across the room, Lucas could see Susan, looking small and defeated. Her once fiery attitude had dissolved into an air of quiet resentment. She sat with her lawyer, a man who looked just as out of place in the courtroom as Susan herself. Lucas couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. The woman who had once stormed his door at 3 a.m. demanding Wi-Fi help was now facing the consequences of her lies. The judge entered the courtroom, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, and everyone rose in respect. The proceedings began with the usual formalities, but Lucas's mind was racing. He knew this wasn't just about his case, it was about standing up for himself and making sure that Susan Wilkins's false accusations would not be allowed to go unchecked. "Ms. Wilkins," the judge began, addressing Susan directly. "You stand accused of filing a false police report, defamation, and emotional distress. How do you plead?" Susan, her hands trembling slightly, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been through this already with her lawyer, but now, under the pressure of the courtroom, her confidence seemed to waver. "Not guilty," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Deborah immediately stood up, her presence commanding attention. "Your Honor, we are here today because Ms. Wilkins has made baseless and malicious accusations against my client, Mr. Lucas Thompson. The evidence is clear: security footage, witness testimony, and the testimony of both the police officers who responded to the scene all confirm that Ms. Wilkins lied about the events that occurred that night." She glanced at Lucas, offering him a brief but reassuring smile before continuing. "Mr. Thompson was subjected to emotional distress, humiliation, and the threat of a false assault charge, all because of Ms. Wilkins's attempt to manipulate the situation and use the legal system to her advantage. We intend to hold her accountable." The courtroom grew still as Deborah's words hung in the air. It was clear that Susan's defense had no solid ground to stand on. The footage from the building's security cameras, which Lucas had requested to be reviewed, clearly showed Susan banging on his door and making unreasonable demands. The footage also revealed her exaggerated claims, with no evidence of any physical confrontation. Lucas could feel his chest tighten as he listened to Deborah's impassioned plea. For the first time since all of this started, he felt a sense of control. He wasn't the one in the wrong here. It was Susan, and she was finally going to face the consequences of her actions. Susan's lawyer stood next, trying to mount a defense, but it was weak at best. "Your Honor," he began, "my client admits she was upset, but she did not intend to cause harm. She was simply frustrated by the refusal of Mr. Thompson to help her with a simple request. We argue that her behavior, while unfortunate, was a result of misunderstanding, and there was no malicious intent." Deborah didn't waste a second. "A misunderstanding," she scoffed. "Let's be clear, Ms. Wilkins didn't misunderstand anything. She came to Mr. Thompson's door, at 3 a.m., demanding that he fix her Wi-Fi. And when he politely declined, she decided to escalate the situation into a police matter, accusing him of assault. A misunderstanding doesn't involve falsely accusing someone of a crime they didn't commit." The defense lawyer stumbled over his words, clearly realizing that there was no way to refute the facts. Deborah had done her homework, and Susan's lies were unraveling before everyone's eyes. The judge turned her gaze to Susan, her expression hardening. "Ms. Wilkins," she said, "your actions have disrupted this community and caused Mr. Thompson unnecessary stress and harm. The evidence before this court suggests that you not only wasted law enforcement resources but also attempted to tarnish Mr. Thompson's reputation with false allegations. This behavior will not be tolerated." Susan's face flushed, and her eyes darted nervously between the judge and the courtroom. It was clear now that she had underestimated the legal process, and her own vulnerability in it. After hearing closing arguments, the judge retired to deliberate. The tension in the room was thick as everyone waited for the decision. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. He was nervous, but at the same time, a sense of anticipation grew. He had been through so much, enduring Susan's absurd demands, the media frenzy, and the legal back and forth. He just wanted it to be over, and he wanted justice to prevail. When the judge returned, she wasted no time in delivering her verdict. "Ms. Wilkins," she began, "you are found guilty of filing a false police report, defamation, and causing emotional distress. You will be sentenced to community service, attend mandatory anger management classes, and pay damages to Mr. Thompson for the harm you've caused." Lucas exhaled deeply, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He had won. Justice had been served. The judge's final words echoed in his ears as Susan was escorted from the courtroom, her face pale and defeated. Lucas stood up, his mind buzzing with the weight of everything that had transpired. As he walked out of the courtroom, Deborah beside him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. He had fought for himself, and he had won. The days after the courtroom hearing passed in a blur. The media storm that had surrounded Lucas Thompson's case continued to swirl around him, but now, it was a different kind of attention. The news outlets had moved on to their next sensational story, but Lucas could feel the shift in his life. The victory in court had not only given him justice but had also forced him to reconsider the power dynamics in his life and the way he interacted with others, especially his neighbors. Susan Wilkins, once a source of constant anxiety and frustration, had been dealt a harsh blow. The court had ruled in his favor, and now, she was facing consequences for her actions, community service, anger management classes, and a significant financial penalty. But for Lucas, the most important aspect of the ruling was the message it sent, that the truth mattered, and that standing up for himself, even in the face of overwhelming absurdity, could make a difference. In the weeks that followed, the building where Lucas lived began to feel different. There was a sense of peace that had been absent before. Neighbors who had once avoided him, unsure of whether they should side with Susan or stay out of it, began to offer him small nods of acknowledgement. The whispers about the incident died down, but Lucas could still feel the undercurrent of curiosity about what had happened. He didn't mind. After all, he had been thrust into the spotlight unwillingly, and now that the ordeal was over, he didn't feel the need to hide. Lucas had decided that he wouldn't let the situation define him. Instead, he chose to move forward, focusing on his work, his personal growth, and his relationships with the people who truly mattered. He didn't want to be known as the guy who had gotten involved in a bizarre Wi-Fi dispute with his neighbor. He wanted to be known for his character, for the choices he made, and for the way he handled adversity. One afternoon, as Lucas sat at his desk at work, his phone buzzed with a text message from Deborah. She had been an invaluable ally throughout the entire ordeal, and he had come to respect her not just as a lawyer but as a friend. "Deborah, I know you've been through a lot, but I wanted to let you know, I've filed for the damages to be paid out. You'll be getting that settlement soon. Also, I'm proud of you. Not just for winning the case, but for how you handled everything. You stood your ground when it mattered, and you made sure justice was done." Lucas smiled at the message, feeling a wave of gratitude toward Deborah. She had been the voice of reason when things seemed impossible, and her unwavering belief in him had given him the strength to carry on. He typed a quick reply, "Lucas, thanks, Deborah. Couldn't have done it without you. It's been a wild ride, but I feel like I've learned a lot through all this." As he set his phone down, Lucas leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the journey. It was strange to think that just a few weeks ago, he had been a passive participant in his own life, letting Susan's behavior control his peace of mind. Now, he had reclaimed his space, not just physically but mentally as well. The entire ordeal had forced him to confront his own passivity, to examine how he allowed others to influence his boundaries. He thought back to the evening of the confrontation with Susan. It had been uncomfortable, but standing up for himself had felt empowering. It had been a moment of growth, one where he had learned that it was okay to say no, that his time and energy were valuable, and that he didn't have to tolerate anyone's disrespect. Lucas had no illusions about what would come next. Life would continue. There would be other challenges, other people who tried to overstep their bounds. But now, Lucas was prepared. He had a newfound sense of strength, a belief in his ability to navigate difficult situations with grace and confidence. The victory in court had been important, but it was the internal changes that mattered most. And so, with that sense of growth and a renewed sense of purpose, Lucas decided to make a change in his life. He had always wanted to do something more with his skills as a software engineer. He had a passion for coding and problem solving, but he hadn't fully explored his potential in the community. After much contemplation, he decided to start a new project, one that could help others in a way he had never considered before. Lucas began to set the groundwork for a community center dedicated to helping older residents in the building with technology. He had seen how Susan's lack of tech knowledge had contributed to her unreasonable demands, and he realized that there were many others in the building who could benefit from some guidance on basic digital skills. The center would be a place where they could learn how to use computers, navigate the internet, and solve simple tech problems. It was something meaningful, a way to give back to the community while using his skills to help others. The idea of helping people, of making a real difference in their lives, felt right. It wasn't about revenge or petty victories. It was about creating something positive out of the chaos that Susan had caused. And as Lucas planned the center, he couldn't help but smile. In the end, he wasn't just recovering from the trauma of the past few weeks, he was building something lasting, something that would outlive the memory of the confrontation. In a way, Lucas realized, his journey with Susan had brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. It had pushed him to grow, to confront his own limits, and to emerge stronger. And for that, he would always be grateful, even if the price had been high. Just as Lucas Thompson began to settle into the quiet after the courtroom showdown and the new beginnings he envisioned, an unexpected event shattered the lingering calm. It was a brisk autumn afternoon when a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of the apartment building. Lucas, busy arranging some flyers for his newly planned community tech center, looked up as the vehicle idled by. Out stepped a sharply dressed man whose presence commanded the scene. He wore a tailored suit and carried an air of authority that was hard to ignore. As he strode purposefully toward the entrance, whispers swept through the small crowd of residents gathered in the lobby. "Lucas Thompson," the man called out, his voice smooth yet firm. Lucas recognized him immediately. It was Councilman Thomas Abernathy, an influential politician known for his dedication to community affairs. The councilman's unexpected arrival at his building sent ripples of surprise among the residents. Before Lucas could speak, Thomas extended a hand and greeted him warmly. "Lucas, it's good to finally meet you in person." For a moment, Lucas was taken aback. Councilman Abernathy, a man whose decisions often shaped local policies, had arrived on his doorstep. When the councilman added with a twinkle in his eye, "I've heard quite a bit about your stand against injustice. I'm proud to see you defending our community's dignity," Lucas felt a surge of validation. It turned out that Thomas Abernathy wasn't just an unexpected visitor, he was a long-lost relative. In fact, he revealed with a conspiratorial smile, "We're family, Lucas. My late brother was your father's close friend. I didn't realize until recently that we had that connection." The revelation shocked Lucas but also fortified his resolve. Councilman Abernathy's support meant more than just words, it was an affirmation that Lucas's efforts to set boundaries and build a better community were seen by those in high places. As the news spread among the residents, murmurs of admiration and encouragement echoed through the lobby. "Your courage has not only improved your own life but has also begun to transform our building," Thomas continued, his tone both compassionate and commanding. "I'm here not only to offer my personal support, but to help ensure that community issues like these are taken seriously at every level. No one, regardless of age or technical know-how, should be made to suffer from neglect or mistreatment." Lucas listened intently, feeling a mix of gratitude and empowerment. In that moment, the heavy burden of recent events lifted slightly. Councilman Abernathy's presence signified that Lucas's struggles were being acknowledged beyond just the walls of his apartment, reaching the corridors of municipal power. Before departing, the councilman extended an invitation. "Lucas, I'd like to work with you to make our building a model of community resilience. Let's consider this an official partnership." Perhaps we can even create programs to help others learn about technology, ensuring that no one else falls prey to nonsense like this. As the sedan's taillights disappeared around the corner, Lucas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The unexpected ally had transformed his narrative from one of isolated conflict to shared determination. In that brief encounter, Lucas realized that sometimes, support can come from the most unforeseen places, proving that unity and family ties can pave the way for lasting change. In the months that followed the courtroom showdown, the atmosphere around the apartment building began to change. Lucas Thompson's decision to create a community tech center had begun to bear fruit. Initially, most residents viewed the center as a practical haven for learning the basics of digital life, but soon, it evolved into a vibrant hub of connection and transformation. Amid this newfound energy, Susan Wilkins, once infamous for her abrasive, entitled behavior, started to experience an unexpected personal revolution. At first, Susan kept her distance, reluctant to face the consequences of her past actions. The bitter taste of defeat in court, combined with the community's clear disapproval, had left her feeling isolated. But Lucas's commitment to building a resource for seniors resonated with many in the building, and slowly, curiosity replaced resentment. One chilly autumn afternoon, as Lucas was preparing materials for a class, he noticed Susan lingering near the entrance. Her posture was hesitant, her eyes reflecting a blend of regret and tentative hope. "Lucas," she began softly, nearly a whisper, I wanted to talk to you." Her voice, once sharp and demanding, now held a fragile vulnerability that Lucas hadn't heard before. Although skepticism tugged at him, he welcomed the conversation. In that quiet moment, it became clear that Susan was no longer the same person who had once pounded on his door at 3 a.m. demanding Wi-Fi fixes. Over the following weeks, Susan gradually became a regular visitor at the tech center. At first, she attended the introductory classes, struggling with even the simplest tasks like sending an email or browsing the internet. Lucas observed her progress with cautious optimism. With gentle guidance from both himself and a few patient volunteers, Susan began to grasp the digital basics. Her initial frustration gave way to curiosity as she learned how to navigate the online world without feeling overwhelmed. Soon, what surprised everyone was the transformation in Susan's demeanor. Her once temperamental outbursts were replaced by moments of quiet concentration. In group sessions, she asked thoughtful questions and shared personal anecdotes that revealed a deep-seated desire for change. As the program continued, Susan's confidence grew, and she began volunteering to assist other seniors who struggled with similar challenges. Her soft-spoken, earnest manner resonated with many, and before long, she emerged as an unexpected tech tutor among the residents. Lucas marveled at the evolution of someone who had once embodied entitlement and discord. With each passing day, Susan's contributions to the tech center not only helped others but also healed parts of her own wounded pride. The community that once saw her as an antagonist now embraced her transformation with cautious admiration. Her redemption was not instantaneous but hard-earned, built on countless hours of learning, mentoring, and mutual support. One sunny afternoon, as Lucas reviewed the center's progress reports, he received a note from Susan thanking him for his patience and for giving her a second chance. In that note, she confessed that the experience had not only taught her about technology but also about humility, empathy, and the strength found in community. For Lucas, it was a poignant reminder that even the most troubled individuals could change when provided with understanding and opportunity. Susan's transformation stood as a testament to the unexpected power of redemption, a story that resonated with everyone who walked through the doors of the community center. In this new chapter, both she and the building's residents found a way to turn past conflicts into a future defined by collaboration, learning, and personal growth. After the courtroom drama had finally settled, Lucas Thompson stepped out of the courthouse into a burst of flashing cameras and an eager crowd of reporters. While some demanded his comment on the verdict, Lucas was already thinking ahead, about the future he envisioned for himself and his community. It wasn't just about obtaining justice for the wrongs done to him, it was about transforming a bitter chapter into a foundation for renewal. The compensation from the lawsuit had arrived sooner than Lucas expected. Instead of succumbing to the fleeting allure of wealth and celebrity, he saw an opportunity for long-lasting change. Lucas decided to invest the settlement wisely by purchasing the entire apartment building where he had once been tormented by Susan Wilkins's relentless demands. By becoming the landlord, he aimed to create an environment where respect, innovation, and community spirit could thrive. Immediately after acquiring the property, Lucas set about redesigning its outdated features. Gone was the drab carpeting that once symbolized monotony. It was replaced with vibrant patterns inspired by musical notes and the soulful rhythm of jazz. A state-of-the-art Wi-Fi system was installed throughout the building, ensuring that every resident enjoyed seamless connectivity and digital literacy. This modernization was more than aesthetic, it was a commitment to empowering everyone in the building with modern conveniences and knowledge. But perhaps the most significant change came with the transformation of the apartment formerly occupied by Susan Wilkins. Instead of allowing it to sit as a reminder of past injustices, Lucas repurposed the space into a thriving community center, the Wilkins Renewal Hub. Here, residents, particularly seniors, could attend free workshops on using technology, navigating the digital world, and even troubleshooting their own devices. Lucas believed that every person deserved the chance to succeed in a digital age, no matter their background or technical proficiency. Unexpectedly, as the weeks turned into months, a further twist of fate unfolded. Susan, whose initial fall from grace had been so dramatic, began to show genuine change. Her bitter, volatile demeanor gave way to a quiet resolve to reinvent herself. At first, she attended the hub reluctantly, as a reluctant observer, but gradually she became an active participant. Under the supportive guidance of Lucas and volunteer tutors, she learned to use a computer, stream video without issues, and even discovered a knack for teaching others the basics of modern technology. Then, in a moment that none could have foreseen, Susan revealed a secret that transformed the balance of power once again. She disclosed that beneath her cranky exterior, she had managed a hidden offshore account, a remnant from her late husband's legacy, accumulating a sum significant enough to change lives. In an act of sincere contrition for her past transgressions, Susan signed over the account to Lucas, who now found himself the unexpected recipient of a fortune. Lucas accepted the gift with humility, vowing to invest it in further enhancing the community center and expanding his philanthropic efforts. With his newfound resources, Lucas continued to build on the initial success of the Wilkins Renewal Hub, providing more free classes, modern technology, and opportunities for growth to all the residents. The twist of fate had not only remedied personal injustice but had sown the seeds for a brighter, more connected future, a future where every resident could thrive together under the rhythm of progress and redemption.